the strike hasn't just occurred spontaneously. There have been months and months of negotiations. In fact, this dispute went to ACAS, the arbitration service. But essentially, the difficulty for the union is that as inflation increases and as the forecast for inflation increases, the union themselves are under pressure from their members to settle for a higher percentage than they might have done a few months ago. So they're under pressure. The workforce under pressure from their own families to say, look, we can't take a 5-6% pay cut. And at the same time, the employers are saying, well, it's tough times for us as well. The difficulty in this dispute, and we can't lump them all together, is that the ultimate owner is an overseas multinational with enormous resources. And I think Unite the Union's argument is this is important for the British economy. There's only 2,000 workers, which isn't a huge number. Surely a company with so much money could afford a slightly better pay deal and settle this now.
Yeah, I think Unite, when we spoke to them yesterday, they were asserting that they'd made some 60 million in profits, 90 million, I think, in returns to shareholders and dividends. So they clearly think the money is there to actually make some kind of deal. But I guess the other problem then is that feeds back into inflation.
Well, it doesn't really, because they're only talking about 2,000 workers, and we're only talking about a difference between a 7% offer and probably something like 9% that they'd settle. So the difference between the two parties in terms of actual cash isn't that great, and that doesn't feed into inflation in any meaningful way. We know this current round of inflation is entirely driven by energy costs due to outside factors. So I don't think it's an inflationary demand. What's happening is simply that workers who can are saying, look, compared to shareholders, compared to senior executives, many of whom earn 10 or 20 times more than the average of the workforce, we deserve a pay rise. And coming out of the pandemic's had a huge impact on attitudes. We're saying, look, during the pandemic, we worked, we actually caught COVID, while the senior executives were nowhere to be seen. And they just feel that that's so unfair that coming out the other side of the pandemic, that these executives should be prepared to pay more, particularly at this very dangerous time in the economy with inflation surging and cost of living crisis getting worse. Yeah. And remember, if these workers get paid more, they will spend that extra money in the local economy. And so that helps to stave off recession.
But you said that you don't necessarily think that it will feed into inflation. I mean, the Unite official we spoke to yesterday saying that they probably would like to see a 12.1% increase to match the inflation rate at the moment. And, of course, that feeds into the other unions thinking, let's just try and push this as high as we can go.
Yeah, but as I said, in this particular settlement, we're only talking about fewer than 2,000 workers. So their pay rise is not going to trigger a massive increase in prices. And also, what's been said here is that the company can absorb it. In other words, the union position, and I think this is something a lot of people will be sympathetic with, is saying, look, companies make a lot of money. If you push up wages, you don't have to put up prices. You can absorb the wage cost increase by taking slightly less profit, slightly fewer dividends, slightly less increases to senior executives across the board. And therefore, it wouldn't be inflationary at all. And the other side, as we know, of inflation is we're heading for a recession. So you could say if you put money in workers' pockets, they spend that money, and that will stave off a recession, particularly in areas where Felixstowe is based, Suffolk, which is not doing very well generally. So there are arguments and counter-arguments. The most important thing is once the strike starts is to get, as you said, get it stopped. And that will only happen, really, in this case, if the company recalculates the cost of the strike to its reputation and to its profits and is prepared to offer a slightly better deal. I don't see Unite backing down over these 8 days unless there's a better deal on the table.
And would you give that advice as well to other employers who are facing strike action at the moment? I mean, as a professor of industrial relations, what do you make of the climate at the moment where there seem to be so many strikes in a lot of industries where the people at the very top are paid very big wages?
Well, I think that's one of the issues. As I said, the pandemic has altered attitudes where people are saying, why are the people at the top getting enormous salaries who actually didn't help during the pandemic? Well, the people on the shop floor who went to work and caught COVID are suffering. But I think the real issue, as you say, is simply an inflationary question. If people know that their wages are in real terms are falling by 10% and probably by 12%, they simply cannot adjust their working lives, they cannot adjust their family lives. And those who can go on strike will. And that tends to be in transport sector, as we saw at Heathrow, as we saw at Arriva buses, and we're seeing on the trains, and in a few other sectors where companies are doing quite well. So really, each strike has its own merit. So I wouldn't argue that every employer should give in. All we're saying is where the employers are clearly in profits, then those profits should perhaps shrink slightly to pay for non-inflationary pay rises. When we look at the public sector, and we've got nurses balloting, as you know, later in the year over strikes, so we're looking at the public sector, then that's entirely down to government. And we'll have to see what the new Prime Minister does when confronted with nurses saying, look, we worked through the pandemic and now we're having a 5% pay cut.